Which is more important in international relations, especially during wartime? Your own national interests or your friends? And how do you defend your national interests without any friends? Well, a whole bunch of very deep and important questions that have come up as Donald Trump has announced that he is pulling U.S. forces out of Syria and leaving our friends, the Kurds, although that's something we'll get into in just a moment, to their own devices against a Turkish invasion into northern Syria. This after a phone call President Trump made with the Turkish president over the weekend. Gentlemen, this is such an awful issue. You know, the Kurds have stood by us in northern Syria and northern Iraq for years now. The Kurds have been helping us out in Iraq since the time of the first Gulf War in 1991. It's a long relationship, and you know, as our own President Woodrow Wilson, who first sold them out at Versailles in 1919. So this back and forth, it goes way back. The Kurdish forces call it a stab in the back, but when you say we're abandoning the Kurds, the first thing you have to ask is, well, which Kurds? There are, I don't know how many different Kurdish militia groups. Some of them are our friends. Some of them are outright communists. Some of them are terrorists and everything possible in between. Melissa McKenzie, a blogger and a friend of mine, she said, well, we'll see if this bumbling around nets better rewards than the planning of previous administrations. And presumably they're bumbling around in the Middle East. Scott? This is not an easy issue with easy answers. So if you don't mind me just giving you sort of an open-ended chance to sort of think this out loud, what are your thoughts on the big picture between us, the Kurds, the Turks, and the Middle East?
Well, there are some benefits to fighting your enemies by proxy, employing local people on the ground, like the good Kurds, let's call them,
sure.
Who obviously understand the lay of the land better than, some guy from Kansas flying in there and landing at midnight would be able to understand it, who speak some of the local languages, and who have access to a whole network of relationships that an armed force coming in from outside just simply could not avail themselves of. That said, in order to get that kind of a relationship with a local set of sandals on the ground, so to speak, you need to be able to make some promises, and then you need to keep those promises. And so if you make promises that you're going to be there for them, obviously we've provided funding, we've provided equipment, we've provided intelligence, we've provided drone cover and things like that. But you can't get so deeply invested in them and then say, you know what, these little tribal foreign wars have never benefited the United States, so we're out of here. And you can't do that, especially when you're in a situation where the Kurds have had custody of thousands, some say 11 or 12,000 ISIS prisoners. I've seen numbers that some 2,500 of those are considered highly dangerous terrorists. And they are in the custody of these Kurds who now, although it's hard to determine what's actually going on, but it seems like the president of the United States is indicating that we're done with that relationship. And right now, at least the American public and apparently our allies do not have a good read on what comes next. I can't believe that this passes for good geopolitical strategy in the Pentagon, at the State Department, or frankly at the White House.
Yeah, Bill, our friend Richard Fernandez, who I often describe as being the smartest man in the world, and I think second place is a distant second place. You might know him on Twitter as Retro the Cat if you're one of our viewers. He tweeted yesterday or today, realistically, there's got to be a middle ground between having nothing to do with the Middle East and being the world fixer. World fixer, but finding that balance point is beyond bipartisan capabilities now. And Donald Trump, through only some fault of his own, is such a polarizing figure that it's really become impossible to have a reasoned discussion about anything political in this country, whether it's domestic policy or foreign policy. So if you're the president and you're trying to decouple us from the Middle East in the same way he's trying to decouple us to the greatest extent possible economically from China, what do you do?
Well, it's not popular to say this, but people who say that Donald Trump is automatically right are kind of as delusional as people who say he's automatically wrong.
We're all human.
Yeah, all of us make mistakes. I'm not saying this is a mistake, but I am saying, first of all, that the idea that you can criticize some of these policies and still support the president should be self-evident. But in these days of ever increasing, just plain viciousness, I just thought I'd get that out of the way. I don't know the actual details on the ground, but I can tell you two things that I do know. One of them is that there is no such thing as a power vacuum. If one power leaves an area geopolitically, another one will come and fill it. It's not like the United States can leave and then there'll be nobody there. If the United States leaves, then that magnetic field will retract and another country will basically project itself into that. And when I say another country, I mean another power. So one of my general rules of thumb is if there are going to be spheres of influence, I'd rather have them be American spheres of influence, which leads me to my second point. It is better to have troops in a country and prevent a war than to have to put troops into a country to fight a war. And so one of the most appalling things I saw during my adult life was the abandonment of the Iraqis by Barack Obama. You can say that the war was wrong. You can say that the thing was not worth the candle. You can make lots and lots of cases that it was a mistake to go. But when it was won and when it was over, and I don't think there's a single fatality in the last 6 months of George Bush's presidency, when it was done and it was stable, to leave then was, I think, catastrophic. And not just catastrophic in terms of Iraq, because obviously Iraq is an extremely volatile subject to this day. The fundamental issue is, to me, with this situation, is not even the story on the ground with the Kurds or anything. To me, my primary concern as an American is it seems to be impossible to trust this country. And that disturbs me greatly. Yeah. Even in Vietnam, there were a number of tribes and local groups who we had enlisted to fight against the Vietnamese. And when we left, we just hung them out to dry. And there is no moral way around that. That's just plain disgraceful. And that's all there is to it. This kind of lack of integrity on the part of the federal government goes all the way back to the Indian Wars, which, again, I'm not one of these people who say that we just handed out smallpox blankets because we didn't even know what germ theory was at the time. But nevertheless, we had signed a number of treaties. The federal government, the United States government, had signed a number of treaties with Indian tribes, and we simply went back on them. We just simply said, nah. That is not the reputation I want for my country under any circumstances. And since we're not talking about a situation where there was a lot of bleeding being done, I think I don't see any way to look at this as other than, from my perspective, a big mistake.
Yeah. Wow, this is a tough one. Yeah, Scott, were you raising your hand to say something? Okay, all right.
No, I was scratching my head in bewilderment.
Well, I think that's a sane response to an insane world lately, or the last 20 years probably. Wow. Dwight Eisenhower liked to say, if there doesn't seem to be a solution to the problem, broaden it. So I'm going to try looking at the really big picture here. And even if I don't like where it goes, I'm going to try and say all the words anyway. Reagan said, he summed up his foreign policy with the Soviet Union privately with just 4 words. He said, we win, they lose. And it was a much different world. It was a bipolar world in the Cold War where the United States and the Soviet Union mostly kept a lid on things. So Reagan used every lever he could, short of war, to fulfill that private pledge of we win, they lose. Today, we live in an age of what military writers Austin Bay and Jim Dunnigan call the age of little wars. And now that the Cold War is over, all of these little wars are bubbling up all over the place, and we find ourselves involved pretty much all over the place. So if I were to choose 4 words of my own, I guess the 4 that I would choose would be maximum violence, minimum time. That being, you go in with everything you have and you Absolutely. Get out as quickly as you can. In other words, pretty much the exact opposite of what we've been doing in Afghanistan since October of 2001. Nearly 20 years, if you can believe that. Bill, you wanted to throw something in there?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, I just completely agree with you.
Sorry. If it's a case of where we lack the national will or we lack the stakes, the national stakes, to go in with maximum violence for minimum time, maybe we don't need to be involved at all. That said, if you were to apply that logic to the situation in northern Syria and northern Iraq with our friends, the Kurds, we're already there. I don't have a good answer for you. To bug out on our friends who have been helping us since 1991 seems like a betrayal, but that's really nothing new for this country. We're the big boys on the block, and we look after our own interests, and those interests seem to pinball around a lot, depending on who happens to be in charge. So I guess all I can say is choose your leaders wisely and pray that your leaders have wisdom. And that's your right angle on that. Brought to you by the members of BillWhittle.com. If you like programming like this, please click on over. We would love to have you on board as members. So for Bill Whittle and Scott Ott, I'm Steve Green. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.